IVM.
In February 2021, for the first time in years, India and Pakistan released a joint statement where both countries affirmed the 2003 ceasefire agreement. You see, in 2020 alone, as per the official statement of the two governments, the armies violated the 2003 ceasefire 5,133 times, killing at least 50 civilians and 24 security personnel, wounding hundreds and destroying several homes. The affirmation to the ceasefire is a welcome move, particularly in a subcontinent where Kashmir has dominated relations and conversation. Welcome. You're listening to States of Anarchy, and I'm Hamsini Hariharan. Every week on the podcast, I break down themes in global affairs and foreign policy, all in the hope of making a little more sense of the world around us. When we talk about Indian foreign policy, the first country that comes to mind is often Pakistan, and by extension, Kashmir. For more than 70 years, Kashmir, ideology, and religion have hijacked the histories of India and Pakistan. But there are also pockets of hope that we easily overlook. Yes, on one hand, ceasefire violations worsened. On the other hand, India agreed to provide Pakistan with 4.5 crore vaccines in the fight against the coronavirus. Even last year, in 2020, Delhi and Islamabad exchanged information on a devastating locust infestation to protect their farmers. Particularly with the India Pakistan relationship, it's important to reclaim history to one that is more pluralistic and considers a multiplicity of actors. How governments dealt with questions about minorities and evacuee property, how they looked at citizenship, how they looked at decolonization. There are examples of cooperation in the earliest stages of the Indo-Pak relationship that are often overlooked. My guest for today is doing a lot to shift the compass of Indo-Pak history to new directions. Dr. Pallavi Raghavan is an assistant professor of international relations at Ashoka University. She wrote a book called Animosity at Bay, an alternative history of the India-Pakistan relationship, 1947 to 1952. In the book, she looks at the amity and the spirit of cordiality that governed relations between the two states in the first 5 years after partition. We're going to talk to Pallavi about how to use this prism to look at relations today. But first, a short break to hear from IVM Podcasts.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, Sia Tires and TheWholeTruthFoods.com. Thank you for your support. We did a bunch of cock and bulls this week. We had guests like Ayushi Amin and Puneet Pania for that. Besides that, Vasanti Hariprakash was on, as well as Jay Alani, a paranormal investigator. Really, really great week on Cyrus Says. Do check it out. Tune into This Round is on Me for an episode recorded from Gulmarg featuring one of India's professional alpine skiers, Arif Khan, who's looking forward to representing India at the Beijing Olympics. On The Habit Coach, Ashton has a chat with Kunal Rajput, a popular fitness trainer who recently completed 7 rounds of his Unlock workout series. The reunified, simplified gang of Tony, Naren, Chuck, and Shrikant discussed NFTs on the latest episode. On The Millennial Athlete, Tanvi and Shlok looked back at all the England championships of the year so far and discussed the interesting highlights of the same. Also on Thale Harate, our Kannada podcast, Ganesh spoke to Archana Shyam of Antharanga Theatre in the latest episode. And on Kadai podcast, our Tamil show, Kavita Jiva shed light in another story about the bravery and excellence in the governance of the Pallava dynasty. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
Hi, Pallavi. Welcome to States of Anarchy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, I think one of the things that I really enjoyed when I was reading your book is sort of putting the emphasis on institutions and state making as an important way in which the two countries dealt with each other in the early years. And I think this is very interesting because not only because of the partition and sort of the contested histories that come from it, but also the historical experience this has in shaping the way institutions were nurtured and fostered and the politics around that. How was your experience when you were writing the book and thinking about some of these ideas around state making?
Yeah, I mean, while I was writing the book, and I should sort of say that, look, the book itself is a kind of revised and elongated version of a PhD dissertation, which I completed in 2012 at Cambridge. in a history faculty, and it was, the sort of meat of the book concerns the aftermath of partition in South Asia and the kind of impact that that had on institution making in South Asia, and how, in a sense, sort of the landscape of South Asia is held together by these institutions that were very deeply impacted by the experience of partition. And so I was, in a sense, the broad kind of theme that this book tries to kind of bring out is that, a state making in South Asia is very contingent. And I mean, it comes together on the basis of, on the experiences of partition. And what I was trying to sort of show is that there was no already there automatically understood idea of nation or state in South Asia, and that these things had to be kind of, arrived at through, the way in which their institutions sort of understood this process. And partition had a really important kind of role to play in that whole process. And it's out of that kind of interaction that the state formation in South Asia took shape.
Yeah, because your book covers sort of the first 5 years after both states got independence. And this is a very complex time, one, because partition is still an ongoing dynamic process. And on the other hand, you already have tensions along the border, particularly in Kashmir. And so it's difficult to sort of, I think, when you're a decision maker in that environment, to look at all of the complex factors that are happening simultaneously and to take decisions which are sort of long term and which are taking sort of stock of everything that is happening. So I think that must have been sort of incredibly difficult if you're a decision maker. It's very easy to sort of look back and criticize a lot of the people who were handling partition, including sort of Nehru and Patel, who've gotten a lot of flack for the biggest migration in the world. But I think when you are a decision maker at that point in time, you're just doing the best you can.
Absolutely, and I mean, what also kind of comes across, in particularly in these years, which is sort of contrary to how the leaders of like Nehru and Patel are kind of subsequently portrayed. What comes across in these particular years is how very kind of tentative and very hesitant and very kind of uncertain they were about about the kind of larger project that they were embarking on, and how, in a sense, many of the decisions that they made about what constituted the nation states of South Asia was done on a hesitant kind of tentative contingent kind of way of thinking about decision making, which is often about saying that, look, for the time being, we'll kind of have this in place, and then later we can come back and revisit it if necessary on the basis of how events unfold, and that kind of contingent nature of decision making, has to be kind of, understood further in a lot of the kind of, scholarship on kind of these leaders. But but what you're saying about, look, the big picture and how kind of the migration, the question about Kashmir, the fact that, in the immediate post-partition landscape, a lot of the issues that confront India-Pakistan relations today were actually already in evidence, including, the merciless persecution of minorities, a deeply kind of tense situation in Kashmir about the line of control. In many ways, like, the landscape was actually already set by 1948 and 49. And yet at that time, you saw decision making that was thinking in a relatively more creative and flexible way about exactly what it is that state making and sovereignty entailed. And what you had in these particular years was a wider and more accommodative approach to how this exercise of nation state making could be done. And I mean, so one of the things I kind of dwell at at length in my book is the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, which is, in a sense, it's an attempt to kind of fix the contours of what is it that Indian nationhood or Pakistani nationhood or Indian citizenship and Pakistani citizenship ought to constitute, how they should be constituted. And that whole approach, to these questions in the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, is much more accommodative. It's like, is more flexible than what the leadership of South Asia subsequently did in the decades that followed partition.
Do you think one of the reasons they could be more flexible and creative is because there was no precedent before them, one, and no situation of this ever happening in sort of like modern history that they could look to. I know that you speak a lot about, examples from other parts of the world, particularly in the 20s and the 30s. But when it comes to particularly the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, and I was thinking about, how South Asia is primarily about who do you include, who do you exclude, who are you and who are you not, sort of in terms of nationhood and who you feel like. So that made me wonder about sort of the pact and stuff. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, yes, to some extent you're right in that, this is the first time that they were doing it. And as I'm, and there's, relatively fewer kind of precedents to fall back on. And certainly, you're looking at kind of hesitant states, kind of a stopgap, sellotape solution sorts of approaches to state making at the time. So partly it's, that it's the first 5 years after partition. And there's, a lot of what I talk about is the subject of like these inter-dominion stopgap arrangements, where they say that, look, we're going to do this for the time being, and then we'll kind of see later. So partly it is that, but partly it's also, I think that what was, also kind of peculiar to these years was that it didn't occur to anybody in particular that this was a relationship that you had to kind of compulsorily perpetuate hostility inside, and that at the time, in these years, in the aftermath of a very chaotic and nightmarish kind of partition, to those leaders, it didn't sort of seem self-evident that a hostile relationship between India and Pakistan was bound to kind of, entrench itself, or bound to kind of kind of solidify. And so because there was sort of this kind of expectation that, look, if the kind of issues that arise out of the partition, and if the kind of questions that the partition throws up, if they can be kind of resolved, and if they can be, if some kind of solution can be found to those sorts of issues, then there's no reason to think that India and Pakistan necessarily have to have a bad relationship in the future, and it's on the basis of that kind of calculation also that you see a different approach to decision making about India-Pakistan relations.
And, it makes me think also of perhaps it's these interactions that, I mean, they continue to sort of hinge over relations today, but they also put in a lot of the sort of boundaries of what India and Pakistan institutions can do in that sense, right? Because I guess it is impossible to now think of sort of provincial governments or institutions at multiple levels taking initiative on their own to have to deal with this. I think at that point in time, because it's not just partition, but the idea of like the maps of India and Pakistan weren't fully consolidated, like kingdoms weren't fully consolidated. They had no idea what to do with property. And therefore, because the situation was a lot more fluid, they were sort of accorded a little bit more creativity in that sense as well.
Yeah, I mean, the situation was, much more fluid, but the conditions that enabled the fluidity in the first place was, in a sense, about a kind of central question that continues to hover around South Asian politics today, which is about the nature of the relationship between the center and the provinces in South Asia. So one of the things that's going on in South Asia, and this process of map making and trying to kind of figure out exactly what constitutes these states, and inside these states, like how much is the province going to be kind of dictated to by the center. And what you're seeing at this time is a different answer to that question than what you see in subsequent decades. And so you're sort of seeing an enactment of sovereignty that thinks that, okay, fine, that state making is really about more federative, looser kind of, an approach to decision making that allows the center to have a relatively looser grip on the provinces and allows the provinces more autonomy in terms of the kinds of decisions they want to put in place. And it's an acknowledgement of that that accommodation that you see this, again, like a more flexible approach to decision making about India-Pakistan relations, at the time, like that trying to work through a different model of sovereignty through this approach.
I think what you're saying is fascinating because at that point in time, then you could see like provincial governments sitting in East and West Punjab sort of working together, or East and West Bengal having to work together. And that sort of thinkable now, except for sort of routine things that they maybe consult each other on. Whereas I guess since you're saying there's a loser variant of sovereignty, since states weren't fully consolidated, that sort of dominated over interactions at that point in time. So whether it's providing security for minorities, which even provincial governments weren't able to do a great job with, or whether it's sort of dealing with enemy property or evacuee property. I guess at that point in time, provincial governments had a lot more leeway and a lot more power, if I'm not wrong.
And it's actually, I mean, don't get me wrong, because even at the time, like, often it's not like I'm trying to say that, look, provincial governments were necessarily at the more, inclusive or accommodative kind of, end of the spectrum. And often, in fact, as you had central governments that were, Delhi, for example, was often the actor that was sort of trying to encourage provincial governments in Assam or Bengal to open up with regard to migration. And it was often provincial governments that were sort of saying that, look, that we simply can't house this kind of numbers of refugees. But at the same time, what there was an acknowledgement of was that it's not the kind of situation where a central government can simply just do exactly what it wants without any kind of blowback at all, and central governments didn't dare to do that because they recognized that that would cost them their seat and that would cost them their grip on power. And so, there's more of a consultative and a kind of interactive approach to these sorts of questions. And both the evacuee property question and the refugee question was, on the one hand, it was a bilateral question between the governments of India and Pakistan and their representatives at these inter-dominion conferences. And at the same time, it was also a center-provincial question in the equal urgency. And you had provincial governments, forcefully making their feelings felt on what they thought of this whole question, and central governments having to, to acknowledge that and to work with that. So in a sense, you're seeing, a greater voice for a non-centralized approach to decision making in the India-Pakistan relationship as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about Pakistan, but perhaps in India, this has followed a pattern where after this as well, you have sort of like provincial or state governments that bargain with the center for their interests, which may not necessarily be in line with national interests sometimes, particularly along border areas. So I don't know, maybe that is one legacy of what these interactions did.
Yeah, and there's also, I mean, there's increasingly, more and more work about, and actually, I mean, when I say there's always been a fair amount of work about how it is that, border states actually constitute the nation state in a very kind of special way, and even though some, kind of the center is sort of conditioned to think about border states as being like these places in the middle of, far away. It's the reason that the center comes into being in the way that it does is precisely because of, how it's constituted by its border. And in a sense, the border provinces of the Bengal Delta in particular play a very important kind of role in how the state of India kind of takes shape, particularly as I show in the book, through its interventions on the question of refugees and how that's to be kind of handled as far as bilateral relations are concerned. So in this whole process, the identity and the state, the kind of identity of India is also being asserted, through this whole process that these border states are kind of making an intervention on these questions. And they really do make an intervention on these questions, in ways that didn't necessarily all add up to a hostile ending as far as India-Pakistan relations are concerned, right? And again, like what you see with the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, but also as far as discussions about evacuee property were concerned, was that it was, in a way, like it also kind of propelled the governments of India and Pakistan to kind of explore ways of finding common ground, which would take away some of the pressures that they were facing from their domestic constituencies. So it worked in really strange, in really unexpected kinds of ways. But the thing that undergirded all of it was that provincial government was a power to be reckoned with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm sort of thinking about that now, because I think even in your book you were talking about how Assam, even in 1947 and 48, strenuously raised objections to sort of the refugees who were coming in from East Pakistan at that point in time. And it sort of made me think about the recent conversations around the Citizenship Amendment Act, and whether that would go against the spirit of the Nehru Liaquat Pact. What do you think of that?
I think that, look, the Nehru Liaquat Pact is like if you're looking for like a case study in contrast, like a polar opposite of present day kind of discussions about citizenship, like you get to the Nehru Liaquat Pact. Like it's exactly the opposite of the debate today. And it's exactly the opposite. And it's also like a striking, and it's also quite, I was saying earlier, like a strikingly new way of thinking about citizenship, and sovereignty in South Asia. But because what the Nehru Liaquat Pact kind of recognized was that, a citizenship in South Asia is there was this, even I think in 1950, in that first few years after partition, I think the leadership sort of also acknowledged that pulling at the strings of citizenship in South Asia is like a Pandora's box. You don't know what's in there. Like it can backfire in all kinds of, it doesn't have to work in your favor. And getting into this question too, kind of, deeply about, look, are you Indian or are you Pakistani, is in a sense not something that the states of South Asia can deal with, because there are just far too many kind of communities that don't very easily slot into these either or categories, and are also armed with kind of their history, which flies in the face of these relatively new and relatively weak states trying to kind of forcibly impose a single exclusivist definition of citizenship. So what the Nehru Liaquat Pact in a sense also acknowledged was that rather than asking people about their birth certificates, their grandparents' birth certificates, and asking them about exactly where it is that, that their citizenship is, that approach to thinking about whether somebody belonged in India or Pakistan just would be, dangerous and would further escalate the situation. And it's a recognition of that kind of problem that this sort of compromise was arrived at. So, the present day moment in many ways escalates that problem even further. And, it's a remarkable thing to do, particularly when leaders of South Asia in the past have recognized that this is a problem they can't really get their hands around, because it's just too unpredictable.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the sort of legacies in sort of like a foreign policy viewpoint that was interesting to me was the Indian diaspora that lived elsewhere in countries in Africa and Southeast Asia, etc. I think that the Indian leadership went around and made a conscious effort to say, if you live in Malaysia or Singapore, even if you are of Indian descent, you are Malaysian or you're Singaporean unless you're choosing to come back to India or Pakistan. And so I thought that this was sort of maybe an idea that was born out of the Nehru Liaquat Pact, saying even if you are a minority living in another state, then you will have to sort of accept your identity as being that minority. You don't necessarily have to decide on one or the other. And I thought that was, just an interesting way to look at citizenship.
Yeah, I think the Nehru Liaquat Pact was, I don't know if it was based on that, if there was a definite precedent, about citizenship laws that enabled that. But at the same time, it's part of this pattern of thinking about what is it that recently decolonized states do about trying to disentangle, the people in them and who really they are. And, and do you kind of sort of think of yourself as, the national of India or Pakistan, or a citizen of the Commonwealth, or a British citizen or an overseas Indian? Like this one of the things that decolonization as a process as a whole offered up, decolonized states were kind of thinking through new ways of defining the rules of citizenship, and what decolonization was actually about was about thinking about new rules of defining citizenship. And it's in that moment that you see, this particular fact about, of a slightly less demanding approach to thinking about citizenship. You see that kind of fact being born in that moment as well. And it's also worth saying that, that the reason that these looser, different ways of thinking about citizenship were being talked about in India and Pakistan was not out of any particularly altruistic kind of motive, but was also about understanding that our decolonized states of India and Pakistan are in no monetary position. They simply can't afford to be able to rehabilitate or look after, the all the, kind of, all their overseas populations. So many of the debates about citizenship, and not just in the India-Pakistan context, but in the context of kind of Indians overseas in other parts of the Commonwealth, were about, the government of India sort of saying that, look, that we can't afford to give them citizenship. What are we going to, feed them or house them with and things. So it's, out of that moment that these more fluid definitions of what citizenship ought to constitute, it's out of that kind of moment that these sorts of discussions are being had.
Fair enough. And since we're talking about sort of overseas communities and decolonizations, for me, one of the most interesting chapters in your book was sort of how India and Pakistan were at international forums. And so could you tell us a little bit about during the first 5 years, what were things that they cooperated on?
I actually enjoyed writing that chapter as well. And one of the things I was quite struck by is that so much of the kind of scholarship on India-Pakistan relations, which is about its relationship in the sort of 70s and 80s and 90s, kind of loses, is sort of focused on the mechanics of their hostility. It really was quite a shock to discover that there were a lot of kind of platforms on the international forum where India and Pakistan were, on the same side of the spectrum. And when you try to think further about how that is or why that is, you get to you also get to kind of, newer, good insights about like the nature of decolonization and the dilemmas that poses, and how, in a sense, for all the kind of differences that India and Pakistan had, which they undoubtedly did, they were also, in a sense, facing similar questions about just how is it that this decolonized state is able to find an identity on the international stage, and it's out of that kind of thinking that you find them at the same side on a lot of these questions. And one of the most interesting kind of exercises in this was about their engagement with overseas citizens of British India in South Africa. And again, when I'm thinking about this question, I end up thinking about a lot about like these, a broader, more capacious, definitions of sovereignty, of what constitutes citizenship, and what constitutes kind of a belonging. And so what happened was that in the late 40s, as the question of South Africa and its treatment of indentured Indians had rumbled on in the United Nations for about a decade, and sort of honed into questions about whether or not Indian origin populations in South Africa were to be given South African citizenship, and its government was sort of trying to argue against it, all within kind of a model of, if you like, of citizenship that was kind of held together by the workings of the Commonwealth, and the British Empire. And so in that kind of context, you find an interesting kind of alignment of interest by India and Pakistan, who are sort of going to the UN and, in a sense, saying the same thing that politicians from Bengal were also saying, which is that, look, we can't take them, we're in opposition. We can't be, they can't be citizens in our country, but at the same time, we'd like to kind of argue for them, for these communities to be given citizenship, in South Africa. And so it's out of a common experience of the empire of Commonwealth and what it meant to try to disentangle yourself, out of the empire. It's out of that kind of experience that you found these kinds of platforms of commonality between India and Pakistan.
Yeah. So sorry, I'm just like thinking of this. This just struck me now. But did sort of overseas citizens of India or Pakistan then have to choose an allegiance in that sense? If I was, I don't know, born a Muslim in Lucknow, would I have to choose to be an overseas citizen of Pakistan or of India? Or did that matter at that point in time?
Again, like it, for example, the historian Sara Ansari have, and many other kind of historians of, of empire and South Asia and, and India and Pakistan kind of worked on this whole question of how is it that this newly decolonized, poor, post-partitioned actor figures out what it is that citizenship means, and you just take anybody who wants to be a citizen inside your borders. Do you have to go according to definitions of birth? Do you not do that, and instead you have to look at descent? So and in the meanwhile, like in what monetary position are you to be able to determine these positions, determine these decisions? Like, are you in any kind of position to say that, look, anybody who chooses to be a citizen of India and Pakistan can just can be given it? So in the case of the Commonwealth, I mean, there were as other historians have pointed out much more than what this particular book kind of looks at. But there were a lot of debates about in the 50s about, look, does this now mean that I can be a citizen of India? And the government of India did have to kind of think about this carefully in that moment of decolonization and think that, look, does our decolonization now mean that all the Indians, in other parts of the Commonwealth, they get to claim citizenship or not? And so do they now stop being, citizens of the British Commonwealth? And does decolonization mean that, look, now you get to be a citizen of India or not? And, the government of India eventually decides against this, and says that, look, we're in no, we can't kind of afford to, it's not automatic that any Indian overseas is just going to become a citizen of India. But if there is a process that will be put in place, and if that can be kind of met, then citizenship can be granted, right? But the question that did kind of it was discussed, was citizenship automatically going to be granted to all overseas Indians as a consequence of the decolonization of India and Pakistan? Is that what decolonization meant? And the answer was that it wasn't going to be automatically granted, that there'd be a process in place.
Fair enough. I'm going to move slightly towards the ideas of war, and you particularly talk about the No War Pact. And I was just thinking about sort of in that context, the networks of knowledge that existed at this point in time, because you're talking about how the Kellogg-Briand Pact of the 1928, I think, influenced Indian and Pakistan thinking about the No War Pact. And, there are precedents in history on how to solve it. And I think the Israel-Palestine issue is happening concurrently at the same point in time. So I know that it's difficult to see what ideas influence what ideas elsewhere in the world. But it makes me also think of, the Kellogg-Briand Pact failed. It clearly failed to sort of resolve hostility between France and Germany. It led to World War II. So why would you, how do you choose precedents that you follow on? There's something that I was thinking about, particularly when, the constitution making is happening, I guess, concurrently at the same time. But when you're formulating treaties, particularly during this period, what sort of international precedents do you choose? How do you choose them? What do you think?
It's interesting that you say this, because one of the things I've been saying is that, we were talking about the Briand-Kellogg Pact of 1928 and how and to what extent it was sort of modeled on the No War Pact correspondence idea was sort of modeled on that pact. And one of the things that I think is also interesting about this whole thing is that, so much of India-Pakistan historiography follows rules that are set in place by the Cold War, and so much of the language that we kind of use to talk about India-Pakistan relations, like brinksmanship, like an armed rivalry, terms like confidence building measures, like a lot of the vocabulary.
Threshold of escalation, yes.
A lot of the vocabulary that we use is sort of modeled on the Cold War, right? And I also think it's worth looking at parallels and precedents in Europe to try to think about what's happening in India-Pakistan relations. And it's worth looking at a nation state making in Europe as another kind of precedent, and I think those sorts of parallels are also useful for the study of India-Pakistan relations. So it's the reason I say this is because, again, if you think about what the Bryan-Kellogg Pact was about trying to stop two European states from going to war again after the First World War, when the entire world had been dragged into like this conflict, over a kind of boundary lines in Europe, and so what the agreement itself had been, the design of the agreement was that, look, the United States would sort of underwrite a kind of arrangement whereby it would be illegal for France and Germany to declare war on one another, and if either of them did that, then other signatories of this pact would be legally obliged to kind of to defend the interests of the wronged parties. And it's this sort of model that the India-Pakistan policymakers used, to the extent that, look, when the discussions about the No War Pact were kind of going on in the Ministry of External Affairs in Delhi, senior bureaucrat Shubhimal Dutt is sort of told that, look, go and find this pact, find a copy, look up what it, Nehru sort of tells him that, go and find this pact, look up what it says. I want to have a sense of what it says. We shouldn't go too far, because this is not about like exactly replicating a precedent, but it's the idea kind of is influenced by it. So it's now the pact itself kind of the correspondence itself sort of does fail ultimately after a year-long kind of process, and they're all and it's what happens is that the kind of correspondence goes back and forth between Nehru and Liaquat Ali Khan, often in the public eye, getting into the minutiae of all the outstanding issues around partition. And ultimately, Nehru's, officials sort of advise him that, look, it's, the kind of solutions that the government of Pakistan is offering as far as the Indus Waters Treaty is concerned and as far as Kashmir is concerned is going to tie us up in too much kind of, legal red tape on the international stage, and it's best not to commit to this on paper. So that's why it doesn't work out. But it's still, the interesting thing about the No War Pact is that it shows that there was a political calculation in place that this is a productive thing to do. It might well be something that will be useful as far as our political fortunes are concerned.
Yeah, in that sense, it could also sort of be a strategic move, right? I mean, I guess it was ultimately decided against for that purpose, but I think there was also sort of a strategic argument that could have been made to say, oh, this is something that could help us long term, either in international forums or just bilaterally. And so it brings me sort of to Kashmir, which is the big elephant in the room that we are not talking about. No, I think there's definitely a conversation change, I guess, like a change in conversation that happens when you take Kashmir out of India-Pakistan relations when talking about India-Pakistan relations. And I'm not saying that it's good in that sense. I'm just saying that so much of India-Pakistan relations are held back by Kashmir. And I can see why, of course, considering the amount of violence that goes on in the region. But it also makes me wonder, when you were reading and you're looking at sort of providing a new framework for sort of India-Pakistan relations and to look at the early years, how were you able to sort of balance the emphasis that's always placed on Kashmir or the border or the partition and look at sort of other areas?
Yeah, I again, like I on the Kashmir issue, like at the time when I was writing the dissertation and also later, I kind of decided that partly because there really is like a lot of scholarship on the question, also a lot of kind of historically rigorous scholarship on the question. For example, kind of Rakesh Ankit, Srinath Raghavan, many others. I mean, like literally, like the chronology and the main events in question are sort of are known, whereas a lot of the material that I was looking at was was just not as familiar to readers as the Kashmir question. So that was one kind of reason that I decided to also kind of leave that out as a focus in the book. I also felt that my doing that enabled me to, as you're saying, like all of a sudden, like you look at a wholly different world as far as India Pakistan relations are concerned, and what sort of the future of the subcontinent is about. And it kind of gives you like a lot of different categories of analysis to work with, which are not security oriented, and which are not about the militaries as far as their positions in Kashmir is concerned. So it's, I mean, I just felt that kind of walking away from that a little bit enabled me to kind of prise open the scholarship on this topic a little bit more. But it's also, I mean, I also do want to say that, look, it's, I mean, so I don't write about it in the book, but that doesn't mean it wasn't sort of there large as life, as you're saying, elephant in the room, all through the 48-49 period. I mean, it was very much a factor in how people were thinking about India-Pakistan relations, and yet you do get to a different kind of outcome. So the fact of Kashmir and all its kind of bloody messiness was definitely part of people's minds even at the time. Yet they were making a different kind of, they had a different calculus as far as India-Pakistan relations were concerned.
The other thing I think is that there's sort of an othering process that happens within both India and Pakistan, right? And this has provided a lot of impetus to the idea of sort of the existence of both of these states. And I'm not sure if that's something that kicked in during the early years, or it's sort of ideas that have kicked in more through elections and more through reasons for security organizations to gain power, etc. So it makes me always wonder about how this othering process worked at that point in time. What do you think?
I mean, it's, like what is really interesting about, a lot of the actors in the partition drama, sort of like the politicians from Assam, Bengal, Karachi, Delhi, they themselves who were in the thick of debates about partition, the two nation theory, UP politics, I mean, population transfers, a definite kind of tendency towards, some of them had a definite kind of tendency towards communal rhetoric. Those particular actors in the 1940s and 50s didn't think in as crustified ways about themselves and the other as far as India-Pakistan relations were concerned, as narratives took shape in the 60s and 70s. So I mean, I keep saying that, look, it's important to kind of keep an eye out for exactly when is it that this idea of the other kind of takes shape, because and that these narratives are forged subsequently to suit the political kind of considerations of that subsequent moment, rather than anything to do with the event of partition itself or the actors who were involved in it. I mean, they, after all, don't come up with self and other in the same exclusivist kind of way that subsequent leaders do. Right. And Sardar Patel is a good example of this, who, again, like in the book, I point out, comes out as a, as somebody who was, attempting to convince, his kind of a vote bank in Bengal to go out, to support Nehru as far as Nehru Liaquat Pact was concerned, because he says that, it's a practical thing to do, that, that relations with Pakistan, this is the practical way of managing relations with Pakistan. So now the way in which, the otherness of Pakistan is sort of understood in the 90s or 2000s as this kind of person, as this kind of entity that that it's inconceivable that you can do business with them. That kind of narrative wasn't set in place in our early period, and it's worth asking why, because it's not like these actors didn't have a sense of the violence and the trauma of partition, or the didn't have a sense of antagonism with one another, but they did, for them, their electoral future, like this narrative about the other, wasn't necessarily the best bet. So it's worth bearing in mind, like exactly who is kind of fashioning these narratives and at what stage, and then thinking about how it's not a direct reflection of the reality of the post-partition landscape.
No, that's really cool because I think a lot of maybe this othering comes in when nation building is actively happening, and when sort of these looser strands of sovereignty make way for sort of more set definitions of what it means to be Indian, what it means to be Pakistani. And one of that is that you are Indian because you are not Pakistani, right? And so you have that distinction that is made that wasn't apparent at that point in time. And I guess that allowed for a lot more I guess like pluralism. I mean, I'm not sort of like eulogizing that period as being very like ideal in any sense, but maybe it was just sort of a different historical time in terms of straddling identities.
So to some extent, I keep saying that it was definitely a different time. Like you were looking at a different set of circumstances, and you were looking at different definitions of what nationhood and statehood entailed. So it was, but it's at this. I mean, what I also want to sort of say is that, look, it's not. I mean, one of the things I also try to bring out in the book is that it's important not to. The actors themselves didn't really romanticize the period that they were in, and it's important not to kind of look at it through a particularly rose-tinted kind of gaze. It's true, it is a different time. Yet at the same time, the people who are kind of making decisions on India-Pakistan relations are also working with with vocabulary that subsequent actors use, and so there is this sense that, look, firstly, there's a sense that, look, India and Pakistan are not the same, right? And the tasks of the governments of India and Pakistan is to work out exactly how it is that one goes about disentangling them, and that the best, I mean, that the partition has happened and that there's no way of kind of reversing that. So this way, I mean, the thing about the thing that made the 1950s a more productive period wasn't necessarily about a desire to reverse the partition per se, but it was about it wasn't that. It was more about how to make the fact of partition work in a way that would be more usable for the people concerned.
Fair enough. So my last two questions for you, Pallavi. The first is, I think one of the great things that you've done is sort of to provide an alternative framework to look at India-Pakistan history. And this is very important, sort of considering the heightened jingoism of the current political climate. Where do you think, so you've covered 5 years, and I know that this itself is so extremely detailed and you had to dive through it. But if you had to look beyond it, where do you think new directions would lead to? I've been saying that, look, it's worth bearing in mind that, look, at the end of the day, I really am a historian. I know a lot about the 1940s and 50s. I'm not actually kind of, qualified as many others are to make, pronouncements about what the future of the relationship holds. But what I will say is that what does come across from the 50s is that there was this kind of recognition by the leadership that the nature of India-Pakistan relations hinges quite closely on the nature of minority the treatment of minorities, and that these two questions are very, very, very kind of closely intertwined, and one has a direct effect on the other, and so and the accommodations that I talk about are also arrived at in recognition of that question, that really the states of India and Pakistan, like one of their kind of important duties is to act as safeguard
of the rights of communities outside its boundary lines in a way that both states are equally able to do, and that a stability between these two states comes out of that kind of way of balancing the process of partition. And that, as I was saying, like that kind of calculation is often does seem like the polar opposite, of how the states of South Asia are acting now with regard to the question of citizenship. I mean, in the 50s, this whole question enabled a different discussion about what citizenship would entail than what happens now. And one of the things that I think does contribute to the nature of the India-Pakistan relationship today is these different definitions of citizenship making themselves felt.
All right. And this is my last question for you. What are books or resources that you would recommend for anyone who wants to know more about India-Pakistan relations in the 1940s and the 50s or any other period?
While I was talking, like one of the Neerja Jayal's book on citizenship, I think is a really useful kind of, book, is an excellent kind of detailed account, of many of the things that I was talking about. I was also, Berenice Guillaume-Rechard's book on the nature of the India-China border and the kind of, again, like the contingent nature of state making is again is a good kind of book to look at.
Thank you so much, Pallavi. Thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for enlightening us with these really cool things that we didn't know about India-Pakistan before.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us. All of Pallavi's recommendations are in the episode bio, so do check those out. If you have questions or comments about Pakistan or foreign policy, you can send them across. On next week's episode, I'll answer listener questions about international relations. So you can mail me at ivmstatesofanarchy@gmail.com or slide into my DMs on Instagram at States of Anarchy or on Twitter at HamsiniH. If you want to show us some love, send this episode to someone who you think may enjoy it. You can also leave us a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app you're using. If you want to be more involved, check out our Insta page, where we post regularly about foreign policy and even quizzes, where you can check out how much you know about the world. You can listen to States of Anarchy not only on the IVM podcast app or website, but on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Castbox, or whatever you're using right now. We'll be back next week.
We live in an age of disruption, of immense change in every aspect of work, life, and business. But is the old way of doing things truly dead? And are we ever going to stop saying the new normal? Join me, Varun Dugirala, on Advertising is Dead every Tuesday as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, creators, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond to dig a little deeper into how we got here, what we're doing now, and where we're headed. You can catch all the episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Hi, I'm Zarina Poonawalla, host of the Empowering Series podcast on the IVM network. I happen to be a peak performance coach and leadership coach by profession, and I'm here to share with you productivity tools, life-altering techniques, and real-life hacks to help you achieve your maximum potential in everything you do, your relationships, professions, careers. So tune in every Monday to unleash your inner power. Be safe, be well, be empowered.